Good evening, everyone. My name is Vanessa Rodriguez of the Howard Hughes Corporation, and we are proud to present tonight's special programming, Community Conversations, a night where we're bringing together some of the nation's most creative minds to discuss diversity, equity, and inclusivity in the arts. We are excited to host our panelists tonight as a part of the Meriwether District Artist in Residence program. Now in its third year, MD Air brings 4 artists together for 6 weeks to live, work, and create in downtown Columbia. They are provided a stipend, studio space, and an apartment during the residency. This year's artists are Johannes Barfield, Peter Crisco, Amy Reed, and Ying Zhu, who were featured earlier today in a virtual meet and greet with the public. We are honored tonight to host a conversation with our distinguished panelists. They are Dr. Erin Bryan, Museum Curator of Photography, Visual Culture, Social Justice, and Contemporary History at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. Colette Basie Colors, Associate Dean for Design and Media at the Maryland Institute College of Art, also known as MICA. Willie Flowers, President for the Maryland State Conference and NAACP. And Darren Atwater, Founding Artistic Director of Soulful Symphony and Artistic Director of the Downtown Columbia Arts and Culture Commission. And Chelsea Lemon-Fetzer, Poet and Fiction Writer and editor of the Little Patuxent Review. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us as a part of this conversation. Let's start by stating the obvious. The Black Lives Matter movement has focused attention on systemic racism and inequality, including assumptions about art and culture. We are all interested in your perspective on how to address equity in the arts. Erin, let's start with you. Talk to us about what you're trying to do at the National Museum of African American History and Culture.
Well, one of the things that we've really been focusing on in the past few years is social justice and Black Lives Matter collecting. Some folks might respond to it as rapid response collecting. We look at it more as strategic response in that we want to be able to look at the Black Lives Matter or current day protests within a longer arc of history. And so we look at the ways that not only we can represent present moments for folks today, but thinking about how this moment might be talked about, discussed, or researched in 50, 100, or even 200 years from now. And so, we have to think more strategically about that. In some cases, we might actually go to protests and, just observe protests, interview people, meet with people to get their names and perhaps interview them later. But what's really important is that we think more strategically about how we can best capture present moments in history. And at the same time, we have to think about how will future generations be able to use whatever information, objects, or research that we do today.
So essentially preservation, right?
Yeah, it's preservation in terms of objects, but for me, I'm responsible for social justice collecting. And so for me, it's really about the humanity that's represented in these protests. It's not just about collecting the objects, but how do we preserve the voices, the memories, and the experiences of everyday people who were actually there, or people who were organizing. That's really important because, history can, and working in museums in particular, can really focus on the object and the objectification of people. But I think it's really important that we always privilege the human experience. And so with current protests, I've been looking more specifically at art and artists. There have been murals popping up all over the country, in cities all over the country, huge mural programs. And it just reminded me so much of, the mural programs that came post 1967, 68 with the Wall of Respect in Chicago. And so there's a way that we can talk about murals within a longer arc of history, again, as representing people's voices, thinking about the WPA and some of the mural projects that came out of the Works Progress Administration during the Great Depression. And so, I think about it in the context of art and art history, social and political history. But again, thinking about the longer arc of history in the context of the arc of humanity.
Excellent, thank you. So the next question is for Darren. Darren, you have played a role in reshaping culture and the musical landscape. What are your thoughts on equity and the idea of Black optics, a topic that you have spoken on before?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of flipped that and labeled it optic Blackness. I'm seeing a lot of Black cultural initiatives from institutions who are kind of repurposing and deploying marketing Black culture and almost trafficking of a culture that's really been suppressed or denied in their historical programming. And so that's become an issue for me in response to Black Lives Matter. Because if you're now deploying and repurposing or trafficking of that culture and you really don't have your organization is destitute of Black leadership upstream and doesn't really give a full view of what, as Aaron said, the arc of our journey has been. To me, it seems like a means of survival and a means of expedience. And a lot of that comes through commodification. And we deal a lot with that in a larger monoculture with commercialism, but to now take Black culture, which has been commodified in our history, and to leverage it upon protests and weaponize it and politicize it, to me is opportunistic. So, I'm about how we continue to nest ourselves in ritual. And as Aaron talked about sound, in objects, we're a sound object, but we're in the moment, we're in real time. Whether it's struggle music or whether it's creating art or strong songs. So as a challenge to institutions, it's to be more aware about what cultural equity means, not just in terms of how you begin to have diversity and inclusion, but how do you begin to have like a redemption in terms of how we move forward and we look at the past, we look at the present, and that kind of points us towards the future. So optic Blackness is rampant right now, and so it's something that I'm hoping that we can make sure that it's kind of cemented in our systems and our structures, and it's not just something that's expedient.
Okay, thank you. The next question is really for Willie. Does the NAACP see itself as improving greater access to the arts by diverse populations, whether it's color, people of color, or underserved communities? How does it help expand exposure to creative work of people of color in order to expand those audiences?
Well, the answer is yes, yes, and yes. At the end of the day, the NAACP is nothing unless it's a grassroots organization. And those grassroots tentacles start in the neighborhoods, in the churches, particularly in the schools. So the history of the NAACP is based on that. It's based on social justice, but it's also based on how we connect with people where they are, and then understanding their challenges where they are. So all of that, even in bad times, the song was sang. Lift Every Voice and Sing is an anthem for the NAACP because one of the first key organizers, James Weldon Johnson, was multi-talented. He wasn't just a organizer, he was an artist. So that's speaking about the NAACP as it is. And it's also the case that he organized with W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a PhD working as a grassroots organizer. You don't get that much anymore, but the point I'm making is that that's the foundation of what real social justice organizing was. It had the spirit and the sound of the people in it, so there could be a communication from the ground up. We've come a long way in that there's a corporate aspect of the NAACP or any organization that loses the grip on what's at the bottom, but we're consistently reminded in our branches. We got 24 branches in the state of Maryland here. And that's where it starts. So in our branches, in all of our organizing, there is sound, there is advocacy to talk about equity in education. So children have exposure and access to everything that they need. Art is athletics. Art is something as complicated as coding, but the more that we offer it along with, the horn and the drum and coding, the more we offer it, not only do we have a better country, but we have more diverse people who have open minds, because music brings everybody together. Art brings everybody together. So that's, like I said, so the answer is yes.
Excellent. And that leads into my next question, talking about exposure, right? And of course, we believe that that starts at home and in early experiences. And for many, it starts in school. So this is a question for everyone on the panel. Do you think parents and teachers are encouraging young people of color to see arts as enhancing their lives and even see it as a vocation or a profession?
I'll say that public education bifurcates art the way they do everything else. The whole subject, the old term subject means separation. And I think that's unfortunate. If I had it my way, there would be music on every block in Howard County where there was a public space. New Orleans does this. So that's just music itself. But it's also the case that we don't open up the world for writers. We don't open up the world for books. The books are separated from everything else in the schools. So all of this enhances young people, opens up their minds, creates, breaks down these silos, I think, around everything, but it also generates them to be free. And when you're free, this social justice activism that we're talking about has people in it and not words in it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to piggyback on that a little bit, just in the sense that we've kind of segmented the public sphere from the family sphere. And I think that when we think about public education or people of color advancing arts in schools, we forget that there's such a foundational aspect of arts in the home or in these institutions that we deem as organizations, but it's organizations like the church. I mean, we take for granted that there's such a deep and a rich history and a deep opportunity for students to be engaged, families to be engaged, for young people to be engaged in these what we've deemed as subcultures. And I think the church, to Willie's point, that we've segmented and bifurcated our society so much that we don't really give enough attention to some of the formation that's happening just in the home, grassroots, just Big Mom and them educating and exposing kids to the arts.
And I think it's also a parental responsibility, right? Exposing your children to a variety of different types of musics and institutions, and museums. Aaron, how do you feel about this topic particularly?
Well, I think it's difficult, right? I don't know. I think about how I learned about the arts, and I wanted to become more of a historian. I mean, I did grow up in a household where the arts were privileged, but not in the same way as some other art historians, right? Some folks who might be working at the Met and some other places who grew up with some certain kinds of works of art in their homes, and their parents took them on trips to different museums and perhaps different museums in different countries. I learned very differently. My father loved music, my mother loved music. And so I grew up with music in the household and all kinds of music in the household all the time, because that's what my father did, was listen to music, play guitar, and he was a leather craftsman, that kind of thing. But also television, PBS, and a number of other programs that I might watch on TV where I would see theater, or I would see bands performing, or documentaries where I would see photography and history come together to tell a story. All of those things really help to inform who I am today. But I would also say, more importantly, again, this whole idea of separating home, community, and school, these separations. School was really important in terms of the kinds of artistic programs, music, as well as visual arts, where we studied music, we sang, we learned how to play different instruments, and we learned how to paint and draw. That was all a part of the education. And you brought that home with you because the school was a part of your community. You were just a couple of blocks away from your school. So you were still in the community and you still felt like you were at home. It's very different today.
Well, I do want to add, because I thought about when they both were speaking, is that the challenge, and again, it goes back to this kind of separation that we create. The challenge with public schools and the arts is there's a price tag on everything. And that creates a huge barrier for young people to even dream about playing a horn or having a electric guitar. So and then there's a price for the instrument, and then there's a price for the lessons. So every time we layer that, we create, we hide away someone who would be enthusiastic or could literally save their lives if they were didn't have these price tags on.
So there's barriers everywhere is what you're saying, Willie.
Yeah, there are barriers, silos, and we, you know, we have to figure out how to do that. It's even, I mean, I was so disappointed when I moved to Howard County to understand how that played here, because not only you have to have the money to do it, you have to be in some way selected to participate in certain things. And I talk about technology a lot because that's like a separated science for young people. And I think technology takes art to another level if technology is introduced to young people early enough.
Yeah, well, you know, it's interesting because we also have like a writer and a photographer on the panel, both Colette and Chelsea. It'd be interesting to hear from them how they ended up deciding to become visual artists, or you know, a visual artist or a writer, and how might things be different today if they were growing up today. What might be a different experience for folks?
Who would like to start, Chelsea or Colette?
Well, I think it's also a question of access. I'm here in Baltimore, and if families don't feel as though institutions are accessible to them, or they don't have a history of access or know-how or know what the protocols are for even entering into those institutions, then they're more likely to not enter into those institutions. So I think it's not just affordability, but it's also understanding that those places are there for all people, not just certain people. And that even if historically you've never entered into a museum, or your mother or grandmother has, you know, doesn't have an education or access to art, or even an understanding of what we mean when we say art. You know, a lot of people think, oh, music is music and painting is art. So even demystifying what we mean and our use of terminology. I mean, we're sitting here and we're talking about art as if everybody on this call understands what we mean, and that we all are even approaching that access and that language from a common denominator, right? So I would even say this discussion is privileged in the way in which we're even talking about art and access to art. So I would even step back, because here in Baltimore, I do a lot of grassroots and community work with inner city kids. And even just starting from, you know, this is what we mean when we say art, right? And that we're all going to start from the same vantage point, that we don't understand or know anything, and that we're all going to learn from the same perspective and understand where we all are located within the conversation.
So Colette, speak more a little bit about that. So when you're speaking to these kids and you're introducing them to, you know, art and talking to them about it, how are they responding to it? What is their aha moment? When can you give us an example of a moment where they realized that this could be an opportunity for them, or something that sparked some inspiration or curiosity or creativity?
Well, for me, the first thing is to acknowledge that I am a Black woman who is an artist, who is an educator. I think that's first and foremost, right? Is that not a lot of people in academia look like me, especially at the level that I've reached. So acknowledging, you know, hey, just like you, I'm a first-gen college student. So access wasn't necessarily there for me. There wasn't someone to say, this is the journey, this is how you do it, this is what it looks like. So acknowledging that to them and for them, that, hey, somebody like me, somebody like you can do this. This is a career path, and it's a skill set. And we're going to step into that together. So understanding the vulnerability with that, and acknowledging that it's work, it's hard work, that mentorship is extremely important, and that we're going to do it together, that there's not, I think it's a fallacy when we say these are safe spaces. I like to say we're stepping into a brave space, because it's gonna, I want to acknowledge that it's hard work, that sometimes it's uncomfortable work, but if you are here to work with me, then we're going to do this together.
Great. Kelsey?
Yeah, so I think in some ways literary artists have an advantage in that it can boil down to having paper and a pen as far as what we need, and our space, just talking about the tools that we need. But then it goes so far beyond that, because we also need access to other writers, access to stories that reflect and inspire our experience. Or in some cases, I think I started writing as a kid because I actually wasn't accessing stories that I felt reflected my experience. And I was so hungry for those stories that I just started writing them myself and allowing myself to get lost in them. Although, I did feel, back in the 80s that my entry point was, writing stories about white children who lived a life like mine. But I had to sort of come over this hurdle to allow myself to say, no, this isn't a story about white children, even though these are the people who I've been reading. This is a story about kids like me. And so, even just sort of drawing my stories differently felt really revolutionary for me as a child, and almost extremely private and a little scary. But I just, when I'm interacting with young people who sort of have that storytelling passion, but don't quite know how to navigate it, or if it's okay to have it, or if their stories matter, I see that such an important resource for them is connection to other artists, really in any medium, but sort of like Colette saying, just reflections of themselves in the art world. These entry points can sometimes just be a conversation with another person who also takes this form seriously and believes in it and understands the ways that you can travel this, into a story, into a poem, and that's really a sacred act.
So Chelsea, those are all incredible points. I guess for me, let's bring it back to Little Patuxent Review and your role there. What is Little Patuxent Review? What is it doing to actually provide that exposure?
So I have to preface this by saying that I am just coming on as the lead editor. So I'm still sort of dreaming the ways that I would like to open that up. I know that I have joined a team who collectively are very committed. And I know that I am walking in the footsteps of a lead editor who just left, Stephen Leva, who was also very committed to holding space for diverse voices, for Black voices, for queer voices, for Latinx and Native voices, all of these. I think that as a journal, we not only are serving our writers, but also our readers need to be served by hearing all of these voices. I love this old article by Rudine Sims Bishop I think she wrote it in 1990, about how stories can be mirrors or windows or sliding glass doors. So we search for reflections for ourselves within the human experience through the literary arts, but also it can be this window into an experience that perhaps we considered other, somebody else's, and how that window through a good story can kind of open into a glass door that we enter into, and in some ways can also change into a mirror or be another reflection of ourselves that we hadn't expected, because maybe a character looked different or a writer came from an experience that we considered very different. So for LPR right now, I'm thinking about, you know, certainly our featured artists, who we are soliciting and how we can continuously remember, you know, to represent diverse voices. But I think also a big question for me is, how do we spread the word about our publication so that we can get a wider representation and submissions? So that's a question that I'm still trying to figure out.
Thank you.
I'll keep you posted.
Erin, do you want to say something?
No.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I'll put out another question for you know, all the panelists. When, for certain ones, I'm going to start with Darren here. When did you know you wanted to be an artist or involved in the arts world? What was that moment for you?
I'm gonna backtrack a little bit and just piggyback off what Colette said about offering kids tools and the language, because this ties directly into my experience. But I believe young people are already creating art. I mean, you know, there's this institutionalization that we have. There's the academy. There's a certain technique and a certain sophistication that comes with your ability to express yourselves technically. But there's kids who are already in visual art and they're in the decorative arts. They just don't know it. They're in whole fashion. It's just giving them the language and the tools to bridge what they see as something aside from themselves. And I say that because I grew up playing in church. I grew up playing jazz. It was functional. It was utilitarian. It was nothing academic. It was nothing institutional about it. It was just what we did. And that aha moment for me was understanding that it was a part of my social ritual. And a lot of times I say we take that for granted, and it has informed me. And the more I get ensconced in what I do as a curator of sound and culture, it's understanding that there's an eloquence of the vernacular that we all are informed by. And it just grows by our ability to express and to connect the dots. And if it's not coming back full circle to people and that everyday vernacular one-on-one expression with people, I think we lose ourselves and it becomes too esoteric or too removed. So if you can keep that moment, that spark, that was for me, it was just being in church and being around people who loved me and where I could mess up and they say, that's all right, baby, take your time. You know, that was just, it was the greatest milieu for me to learn how to not only be expressive, but to understand that this was a part of a larger community and that I was informed by that. And I was also forming my own expression that was impacting people.
Thank you. Colette?
What was the question? The aha moment?
Yeah.
I think Darren actually said something really important. I don't know if it was necessarily an aha moment. I too felt early on that I had this gift, but not having anyone in my family who understood what that gift was. I think really I internalized it, and it was something that I just did. That was a part of me. I didn't have a language for it. It didn't fit in any particular box. It wasn't necessarily shaped because really I just did not have access to anything or anybody around me to help shape it or form it. So it literally wasn't until I entered college that really I started to understand that this gift right, which was just a part of me, could actually be shaped into something that could sustain me. That I think that's also why mentorship is so crucial for me, because there were people once I entered into that educational space that really saw something and helped me to shape it and form it and helped to catapult me forward. And so without those individuals around me, I would not be where I am today. And so for me, it's extremely crucial that I do that with my students, that I be that for my students in the classroom, but also all of the work that I do outside of academia on my own time in my own space, in order to be that catalyst for other students, like Darren said, who are internally artists, who are gifted, but just really don't have the access or the venue or the people to help them shape it into the possibilities of what it can be. So,
Claude, I have a follow-up question for you. Do you feel students at MICA are familiar with work by artists from other cultures?
I was hoping you'd get to that question. MICA is representative of the world. So the students are coming from, all over. We have this phenomenal global perspective. I think students are coming with understanding the benefits and the necessity to bring their cultural understanding into the classroom. I would actually say it's faculty that are trying to play catch up to that, because academia is still really centered on a Eurocentric focus and historical way of really looking at academia. And so students, I think, are coming in and saying, this is not okay. What about me? I want to see myself and my culture represented in this education, that I am paying for. And so I think right now it's a recentering of really what is the core mission of academia, and how do you bring all of those voices into the educational space, and the necessity to actually do that. It's a global world, and we're sending students out into the global world to be citizens of that, to be the next Aaron Bryant curator of the museum. So heaven forbid that they don't have a more complex understanding of the world in order to, for every single one of us to be representative in all of those creative spaces.
And how is the faculty, how are they reacting to that? Are they open? Are they embracing it?
That's the heavy work. If you've been following academia for the past 5-6 years, students all over the nation have actually been rallying for this kind of change, moving away from the white-centered European way of teaching art and design education. So students are demanding it. And institutions are trying to play catch up to that. And so that is the hard work, is to bring everyone along and have faculty, administrators, leaders of education understand that it's not adding on to the education, but rethinking what is the central core and mission of education, that it can't be siloed, or this kind of work and these kinds of discussions and these kinds of creative ways of thinking can't be floating around on the perimeters of the way in which we teach, but that every single person has to actually step into it and center identity, cultural identity, into the ways in which we are teaching and educating. So it's not necessarily, do you want to do this, but it's a necessity to do this. You must do this.
Thank you, Darren. I think that this is something that's really interesting, and particularly with your role in starting Soulful Symphony, and the idea of having American roots music be the essential core of what you do. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that? I think that's pretty relevant right now.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's took a long time to really understand that our American roots were a treasure trove that we were ignoring in terms of how we identify and how we frame our arts. And what they don't tell you in this Eurocentric model is that all of classical music at one time was embedded and nested out of their folk traditions. Mozart was all Austrian folk music. He was writing for imperial balls. Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony is all Russian folk music, peasant folk music. So this idea that now we have this great heavy canon of Western European music, and we get to America, and now we're trying to come to terms with the sociological issues around, does any ascendance come from African American and Native American music to build our identity and our musical traditions on? And we're still struggling with that. Dvorak came here in 1895 and said, how come you're not looking to your soil for your national identity? And it was because what greatness can come from people that we basically dehumanize. And so we've had that in pockets where composers of Western classical music has looked in almost cherry picked from jazz and vernacular music, Gershwins and the Copelands, specifically with jazz. But there's a whole landscape of American music that I have looked to. I've been intentional about. We've done everything from gospel to a hip hop symphony. And it seems really iconoclastic to many, but it's what cultures do. I mean, you take your culture and you design your art around it. You frame your art, you frame your experience around it. Otherwise, we're mimicking and we're parroting European culture forever. And it denies us the greatness that we are, and it denies us the ability to not only have our experiences told musically and our stories told musically, but then to begin to form institutions that help to socially engineer what we're about here. So Soulful Symphony kind of is a model for that. Not so much intentional as I believe it's a time long overdue for institutions and organizations and ensembles like that.
Yeah,
Great.
that's actually pretty. I go back and forth on this when I think about the pros and cons, because in order for you to talk about it that way, you have to understand European music. And so I wonder to what extent. I just remember I actually went to Yale Drama. I went there for management, but in producing shows, you're working with all of these artists. And I remember asking the artistic director, you have all of these students who come to this place. They all are incredibly talented. It's not, you never really think about it, but when you go to a school of drama or visual arts like MICA, or you're studying music on a graduate level, you're not going there to learn to play piano necessarily. It's really interesting that you don't go to music schools to learn music, to learn to actually play an instrument. You learn to craft your talent with an instrument to a certain degree. Well, at any rate, so I was talking to him about all of this, and he says, well, it's about vocabulary. It's about being able to help students to understand, the history of a certain kind of art form, and then how they're going to respond to that history, how they're going to position themselves within that history, and when I think about art history, it's very similar in that in order for me to curate and to make a way for other kinds of artists, I have to understand the intervention that artist is making in the history. So that, when I look at the history of certain kinds of art, say photography, social justice photography, civil rights photography, even more specifically, understanding the history of civil rights photography and the photographers who shaped that history, and realizing that they're all white males. As a curator, my understanding that history helps me to say, so my role is to open the door for, say, women of color who focus on social justice. So you sort of have to understand that history in order to understand your intervention, how you're going to disrupt that history, how you're going to kick in the doors to a certain degree. And so, I'm just wondering, how do we prepare people with that balance where you have artists who are creating art and they may not be able to make the connection between what they're doing and what might have been done 10, 20, or 40 years before them. You know, Chelsea was talking about writing, and one of my favorite writers, well, two favorite writers, August Wilson and Toni Morrison. You know, you talk to any writer, and they all tell you become a better writer by actually reading. You know, you can't be a writer just by writing. You actually have to read. And it's the same thing, I think, with being a musician, a photographer, or a painter. You don't just paint. You become a better painter by studying other painters and understanding what your intervention is going to be in that. And you learn from that. And so how do you sort of create a space for that? Or do you worry about it at all? You just let people create, and you know, you just go from there. I'm just thinking about folks that I mentor, and photographers in particular, and how I really want them to understand how they fit within a genealogy of other photographers who came before them, particularly African-American photographers. But at the same time, I don't want to disrupt the fact that they're brilliant and they're talented and it's just organic. You know, you don't want to say to them, you know, your work looks a lot like, reminds me of, or boy, you know, you're in a conversation with, and they sort of look at you like, who are you talking about? But you want them to have that knowledge so that they can understand how powerful they actually are. Like, you're really making a statement here, because for 100 years, no one else has done what you're doing. Yeah. You know, and they don't get that if they don't understand that historical context.
I think it's both and, not either or. I mean, I think of someone like Duke Ellington, who, you know, these military instruments were just laying around after the Civil War, and they began to appropriate it for jazz and ragtime. And now we have persons like Wynton Marsalis and Jazz at Lincoln Center who have a whole canon of music. And Duke was really just like, oh, let me take some saxophones from this marching band, military instruments, and it just kind of coalesces together. So I think you need both the practitioner, someone who's being kind of coming up from inside of the soil. And then sometimes I believe the culture needs to be rained down on people, and in a sense of a larger historical context in terms of what you do as a curator and what we all do in terms of inside of the institution. But if we have the institution and the practitioner or somebody who's organically creating feels, you know, sometimes they are in tension with each other. There's a dissonance there. So I think it's important to have the conversation both ways.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I want to say that the opportunity has to be there first. And I think that we get ahead of ourselves when we talk about the end. There has to be opportunity at the beginning. My experience, I guess, being interested, being a writer, was just reading the local paper in my little town in Alabama. And the reason that I found out later that my grandfather, who could not read, he inspired me because he got the paper, was he would want to sit at the town square, and you had to have money in your pocket to sit at this town square. And if you had a paper, that meant that you had money in your pocket because of these black codes and this kind of nonsense. But the point I'm making is, like, reading the pictures in the paper at age 2 or 3 inspired me to understand or be interested in the town, the mayor, and it inspired me to want to write for the newspaper, right? So my interest became politics, and of course, once I understood black codes, I wanted to break it and the whole system of racism, and I will die trying to do that. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that there has to be opportunities created, because I say this in a lot of speeches, and the fact that Stephen King, I'm convinced that he would have been a mass murderer had he not shown an appreciation for writing and reading, right? So same thing with the guy who created Hannibal and Silence of the Lambs. So I know that when the opportunities are there without barriers, that not only will we have young people who are going to be thirsty for and excited about any avenue, despite the criticism that come, because when you're a black boy, the reason I even love Darren Atwater when I see him is because he's doing what my mother wanted me to do. She wanted me to play the piano. But when I went and took my first piano lesson, I had my little book, and I walked to the teacher's house, And I did not make it up my street without the ridicule that came from everybody on the street. So I never went back to that piano teacher again.
I had a secret for that, man. I used to play like, you know, pop tunes and movie scores for the homies, and they give
I
me.
didn't make it that far. So, I compensated by being in a marching band, and you know, she appreciated that. But my point is, there are a lot of barriers that we have to figure out how to break as early as possible, so that the pipeline can be what they can see and not what we think they should see.
That's a great point.
Well, all of that was really interesting. Years ago, I saw this documentary, well, decades ago at this point, and it was about this. The filmmaker was interviewing these folks in a really rough neighborhood, I think in Detroit, maybe one in Detroit, another in Chicago, one in New York or something. And he was following them over the course of their formative years as teenagers until they became men, I believe. And they were in and out of prison at one point. And they all were artists, which was also really interesting. And so at some point in the film, the cameraman asked him, he said, "So why are you doing this? Why is this important to you?" And, you know, the director, the guy who was actually doing the interviews, he just started, you know, crying, getting misty. And he says, "Because I don't know how many prisons are filled with the next Picasso. And I think it's a shame." And so part of the reason, as they talked about how talented they were as artists, that they had to hide it from the homies. They had to hide it from their friends. And that was one issue. But the other issue, not having access to teachers who encouraged them, or opportunities to take classes, or someone saying that, "Wow, you're incredibly talented. Let me nurture you," which is something that Colette talked about earlier. And I guess the question is, you know, how do you really get past that? Because I never forgot that question from that movie, even though I might forget everything else about the movie. You know, how many prisons are filled with the next Picasso?
Thank you. I think those are all incredible points. I think one of the things I'd like to do is we're running, unfortunately, this conversation is going so well and it's so interesting. And we only have about 11 more minutes for the panel, but we have some questions from the audience that I'd like to start with, if that's okay. Question number one, knowing that this doesn't happen overnight, I'm curious if any panelists have thoughts on how smaller arts organization can start to make all people feel welcome in their galleries/spaces. Colette mentioned this, and I know there's not a one-size-fits-all solution, but any thoughts on where the biggest blind spots are for organizations that want to be more welcoming, but aren't sure exactly how to do that, and going about it in ways to create meaningful, sustained accessibility and inclusion that benefits the communities they claim to serve?
Well,
Who would like to take that?
I can jump in. I think that's really about, and this came up earlier, bringing people of color to leadership positions and to these decision-making positions within arts organizations. I mean, that makes all the difference. There's an insight there. When people see their communities reflected in the leadership, it changes the way they might approach an organization. So I think that's a huge one.
well, I will add here. I certainly commend Ms. Colette, Dr. Colette, for expressing that in this European framework is important to discuss, because what you get with it is this sense that there is some perfection in any of this, and there is not. There's not perfection in that piano that Darren Atwater played. He became perfect over time. He's still trying to work at it, right?
Hey, brother, yes, sir.
And so, but nobody tells you that. So it's almost like you got to be perfect in this European mind. Ain't nobody perfect.
Absolutely.
I will also add that any organization, I'm on the Little Protectant Review, and trying to figure out the best way to expand it, you know, and they're open to everything. But the other piece about the perfection is that even some Black folks, and this is kind of elephant in the room, have accepted the only way they could excel is to be in that European framework or mindset. And that doesn't get us anywhere. because you don't have an advocate when you get there. And so that's something that we should all be aware of. And so that is a grassroots way of thinking about it. And I want to acknowledge Darren Atwater again. And he may know about this, but there is a church called the United House of Prayer for All People.
Yes, sir.
And
That trombone
what they do, and I don't know what the history is on it. I know that the leader of it wanted sound, but they have brass bands that are outstanding. And they let anybody, any child who wants to play, and make a big band. So there's no perfection, but as they play and play again, they get better and better. So those types of small things are what we have to continue to do. But in regard to diversifying, this is a time for it. Nobody has an excuse not to break these sick, sustained, racist, white supremacy structures that should have been broken a long time ago. You can break them now. I mean, everybody's trying to burn them up, so jump in there and tear it down, deconstruct what has been holding us all back and separating us.
I would also add understanding what is culturally relevant to the communities that you want to reach is crucial. And what Chelsea has suggested, if you have, BIPOC leadership within your institution, then you're more likely to have a deeper and more complex understanding of what might be culturally relevant. I would also say advertising, diversifying where you advertise is really crucial to reaching the demographic and the different populations that you actually want to reach. So thinking about, are you just publicizing or you just have airtime on NPR, right? That may only get you a particular demographic. So thinking a little bit more broadly and diversifying.
I think you're exactly right, Colette. I think it's also understanding who your audience is, who you want to attract, and where do you find them and communicate with them in the way that they want to be communicated.
And let the young people in. Let the young people in. Let the young people shine.
I think fearlessness and courage is also something that should be required today with our institutions. We can't underestimate the importance of courage, because even if you think about bringing in, one of the things I always say at work when we talk about how diverse our staff is that diversity goes beyond just the surface of how we all look. If we all look differently, but we think, act, and talk the same, and we're doing this, and we think, act, and talk the way that people 10 and 20 years thought, act, and talk, that's not really diversity. That if we want diversity, we have to be fearless. You have to be courageous and really commit to doing something different and looking to create something that looks different, that acts different, that sounds different. And, that's what I really enjoy. That's what I enjoyed about my work at Morgan as a curator. That's what I enjoy now. Is that I can be as different from every other curator in the world if I want to be. That's quite all right. And I'm in a space where you can do that. If I were somewhere else, I might be required to be like every other curator there. So, that's all about leadership. Leadership has to say, no, it's okay for you to want to just focus on transgender, lesbian, civil rights, social justice, Black Lives Matter chefs. To be able to think as differently as possible is really important. But what happens with leadership is that we sort of want everyone to sort of fall in line to fit a certain culture. And part of it is because we're afraid to take risks. Don't do anything different because it's too risky. If you take risks, we can't raise money. If we can't raise money, we're going to have to shut our doors. So that's why it really does take courage, particularly on the leadership level, to say, no, we're going to do this completely different.
Here we have time for one more question. And the question is, as a supporter of the arts, I would love recommendations on how I can help locally support the fight for diversity and equity in the arts. How would someone go about doing that?
I think you should look into those schools and make sure that young people don't have to worry about fees and worry about paying for horns, and be a development-minded person who can help give them access to whatever they need to write, to sing, to play horns, to paint, whatever. It should not be a price on that.
I think we have to be as courageous, and as it has to be as subtle and simple as we are comfortable with cuisine. Everybody, you know, we have no problems when we're experiencing other cultures in terms of cuisine. It's being courageous to say, hey, we're going to check this out. You know, it may be a genre or a culture that you've never experienced. You have to be really courageous to step outside of yourself and support specifically in your local area. And a lot of that local, regional culture is being grayed out by mass media and what we digest, which is most of what young people are digesting by those, you know, big conglomerates that are run by corporate America. So they get just a small silo of what culture could be. And then not to mention that our local and regional gets completely grayed out, and just how special and unique that is, regional, local art and culture, to support that and to make sure that you're bringing your friends and everybody along. It takes a village to do that.
Yeah, I'd like to give some examples, some things that I found actually not that difficult to organize here in Baltimore. We had a restaurant before the pandemic that closed down. They were closed on Tuesdays, and it turned out one of the co-owners really loved to write. And so she reached out to me about, can we just open up on Tuesday evenings and let anyone who wants to come in and just write with us? And would you lead a workshop? We did one in a preschool for parents of really young kids who, you know, they had these couple of hours where their kids were in school and maybe they had a minute to just sit together. So finding even just little things like that where you can gather and create a space for art making, this outside of schools. But I really agree with Willie. I think schools need so much. That's where you can really spark something in a child that will last them a lifetime, just to even, you know, put that horn in their hand. And maybe it's a matter of talking to the larger community about, hey, can we compile, you know, like $500 to just equip this wish list for our music teacher, or, you know, for our visual art teacher, and seeing how just asking and starting these conversations can snowball into something that makes a huge, huge difference.
I absolutely agree, Chelsea. I just did a donation to a high school. I had sewing machine, I had fabrics, things of that nature that you don't necessarily think, or, you know, most people may not think, oh, a sewing machine, is that really a, you know, art making equipment? Yes, absolutely. And so I just did a big donation to an art program at a local high school. So it doesn't have to be something super complex. Just look around your house. What do you have that is taking up space? Yeah, teachers are in dire need of equipment, of materials, anything. Absolutely.
And I just saw a note from Robert Miller who said that 15%, only 15% of the students in Baltimore public schools have access to art. And that's extremely disappointing, disheartening, and something needs to be done about that.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because I remember as a kid in elementary school, there was a real close relationship between art institutions and the city of Baltimore, which is where I grew up. You know, I just remember painting in like 4th and 5th grade, and then the Baltimore Museum of Art would, you know, curate paintings that kids had made in, you know, different city elementary schools, or being a part of the Baltimore City Bell Choir. You know, can you imagine these teeny tiny little like xylophones, and it's like hundreds of elementary schools down at the Civic Center playing, you know, I'm a Yankee Doodle Dandy, you know, or even working with a piano teacher and at my elementary school, and then she takes you to Peabody to audition for a scholarship. You know, it's like, does that even happen anymore? It just seems like that should be available to every student everywhere. But then you hear the statistic that it's only 15%. It's like those kids, again, how many Picassos will end up in prison, you know, because no one was able to recognize that they had some sort of talent because they didn't have access. And that's disheartening.
Yeah, I think as we're fighting the fight of cultural equity, we need to be on the battlefield with the cultural literacy aspect of it as well. It's just as crucial. And as artists that are, you know, performers, whether it's, you know, our artists on the wall or on the stage, I always say there's one thing to be inspirational where you show up and you do a performance, but it's the transformation takes place when you're in the trenches of your community, where people can touch and feel you, and they have access to you. And it's a touch point. It's like I can become that not only because you inspire me, but I can have a conversation with you, because then they understand that their story is your story.
It's like that famous picture of that kid in the Oval Office.
Yes, touching his hair. Yeah. Obama touching his head. Yeah.
His mouth is wide open, and he's like, "Your hair is just like mine."
Absolutely.
The president had this.
Yeah, that's something I'm structuring at Micah right now is our BIPOC female students, because I do a group of sacred space for women of color, women identifying students of color. And so what we have determined is that we would like to do is a ongoing panel, so to speak, going into inner city schools and showing kids, this is what Black female identifying artists look like, and you too can do this. So I absolutely agree, Darren. I think seeing yourself, right, and the possibilities of what can be, and seeing somebody that looks like you, that represents that and has made it, I think goes a tremendous way to kind of opening up the door for kids to understand that it's a path. And through that path is possibility. So
yeah. So
I'm sorry, go ahead, Aaron.
Well, I was just going to say, so this takes us right back to the very beginning of the conversation. Right. It's like it's something that Darren said earlier, and Colette, you talked about as well, that it's not just about getting the funding. Like, you know, diversity is a cute thing to do because it's now one of Mellon and Ford Foundations. Right. Social justice and diversity. So let's do this so we can get the money. It's about having people in those spaces, which is what you both said, you know, where people can see themselves.
And lastly, I was going to say to that point, it's also making sure that you have markers where you have accountability to your own blind spots within our own culture. Because I experienced that as an African-American composer. Like, okay, we need to have more African-American composers. But if you're thinking in a structure of composers and patriarchy, you're thinking African-American men. So then you're getting challenged. What about women of color? You know, what about transgender? So there you always have to make sure that and that was something that one of my colleagues pointed out. It's like, as much as we're saying, okay, people of color, composers of color, it's still so very layered. The work is dense and textured. So we have to make sure that we're always pushing and making sure we have accountability.
Yes. And to our queer community as well. Please.
Absolutely. Yes.
Remember, that's one thing I think that, you know, the Black community at large can struggle with is remembering the space for LGBTQ.
Yes.
Well, I think that LGBTQ people have influenced the Black church and the music in the Black church more than anybody. So I take exception to that because they have played a tremendous role throughout the history.
Yeah.
Well, I am very sad to say that we have run out of time. I think people have been enjoying very much the discussion, and I know that we've gotten some comments about having a part 2, so we can talk about that at another time. But I'm sadly going to say that we have to end the panel discussion today. For right now, I want to thank everyone that has joined us to be a part of this. Aaron, Lily, Chelsea, Colette, and Darren, thank you so much. The conversation was very much thought-provoking and brought up a lot of interesting topics that I think we can spend hours talking about some more. So stay tuned for that. For those who are with us, thank you for joining us. And for those who are not able to join us, we will have this recording and we will be hosting it on our meriwetherdistrict.com website. So thanks again for everyone who joined us, and have a great evening.
Thank you.
You.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care.
Pleasure.
Bye.